Hey ladies, welcome to session 2 of our study through the book of Judges. Hopefully your homework was helpful in guiding you through a basic understanding of the first 2 chapters of Judges. But today we're going to briefly review the chapter's contents. Then we'll identify one failure that we see represented in the text. And after unveiling that failure, we're going to identify the opposite behavior and how Jesus redeems that failure that we see. And then in our group time, we're going to read some more New Testament verses and reflect on how these truths affect our lives. So let's begin. The first thing before we start that we need to remember a little bit about who we're dealing with here. The 12 tribes of Israel are named after Jacob's sons. And that's Jacob as in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if you're trying to keep the family tree straight. So Jacob's sons are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, and Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, you may be familiar with the time Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery in Genesis. After Jacob and Joseph were reunited, out of Jacob's love and favoritism, he gave Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, equal standing with the other brothers. And that's why you don't often hear of the tribe of Joseph, because both Ephraim and Manasseh, we call them half tribes, they make up the tribe of Joseph. So it's a little who's who before we kind of get started, that when you read those names, you're talking about members of the 12 individual tribes. So chapter 1 begins with the continued conquest of Canaan. Verse 1 says, "After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, 'Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?'" What stands out to me here is that phrase, inquired. Israel inquired of the Lord. The people here are in communication with God. They're seeking direction and following through, and it goes well with them. I just want to take a minute to soak that in, because that is not how the rest of the story goes. It's not the theme of the book of Judges. So Judah and Simeon take their armies and go, and the Lord hands over the people. Each city and town in Canaan at this time had its own king, and one was Adonai-Bezek. It may seem like a strange detail that we read in the rest of this chapter, that after their battle with him, that they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. But I'm not sure if you've ever tried imagining standing up without big toes. And the other thing, do you know what you can't do without thumbs is pick up a sword. So this inclusion of the detail of cutting off Adonai-Bezek's thumbs and his big toes shows us that they were preventing him from ever engaging in battle again. And this was a common practice of the time in the ancient Near East, as we see that Adonai-Bezek himself practiced this. So then Judah marches on and has victory in a few places. Caleb, who's one of the initial spies who scoped out the promised land with Joshua initially, he inspires his nephew to take some land, giving him his daughter as a reward. And when I was reading this in preparation, it kind of hit me for the first time. Is he having to incentivize the Israelites doing what God asked in order to take the land? He kind of says, hey, if someone goes and takes this land, I'll give you my daughter in marriage. And it kind of just reads like the people already are just not that thrilled about going and engaging in battle and taking the land. And so Caleb, what sounds like it tries to kind of inspire them to do the task. the couple that get married, they ask Caleb for springs, and that shows us here that the land without water was pretty useless. In verse 17, we see Judah and Simeon have success over 3 major Philistine cities in the plain. But before we get excited, we see quickly that the text says they could not drive out the people in the plain because of their iron chariots. They had success in the hill country. The Israelites had success in the hill country where chariots would have been ineffective. But they struggle in the plain. And this tells us that after conquering those 3 cities, Judah had no success beyond this and perhaps even lost those cities quickly. And we're going to come back to this detail a little bit later. We continue to see that Benjamin is not having much success either, the tribe of Benjamin. And then we come to a passage that I want to read, which is Judges 1, verses 22 through 26. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Now, this is a portion that just reminds me of the story of Rahab. Just this, the people coming in, they identify someone who wants to help them. And even though that person is the enemy, they help the people of God and therefore receive blessing or protection or rescue because of it. And it reminds us here that God isn't against people. He's not against the Canaanites. He's against idolatry. Throughout the rest of chapter 1, we have just failure after failure of the tribes to follow God's command and conquer the land. Chapter 2 opens, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you." As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. So here we see that the Israelites failed to follow God's directions, and they turned to other gods. After this, Joshua dies, and all the people of his generation die, and the people begin to worship the Baals, or false gods, turning from the one true God, whose miraculous work their parents and grandparents had seen with their own eyes. In the end of Judges 2, we read of the cycle that will repeat throughout this book. It goes like this: Israel worships idols, so the Lord turns them over to their enemies, and they suffer. The Lord, at this point, would be moved to pity as his people groan and would send a judge to lead them. They would have success while the judge was alive, but when the judge died, they would return to their wickedness, and usually even more. They would not turn from their wicked ways. Chapter 2 of Judges ends, "So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So last week, at the end of the book of Joshua, we reminded ourselves of this promise that the Lord made. He said, cling to the Lord, and he would be with the people, or turn away from the Lord, and he would not drive out the nations before his people. And what do we see here at the end of Judges 2? He is still a promise keeper. God is still a promise keeper. We may not like it, but he did what he said he was going to do. So, of all the failures in the first 2 chapters of the book, where do we focus? And to determine that, I asked God to reveal, how did it start? And the very first failures that became the domino effect for all the others, I chose 2. The first is apathy. We know that apathy is, the definition of the word is a lack of interest, or a lack of enthusiasm, or a lack of concern. And the second failure is apostasy. And the word apostasy means the abandonment of a belief. And we see these 2 failures, apathy and apostasy, woven throughout the book. We see it in Judges chapter 1, verse 19, which says, "And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron." Now, the context of the Bible up until this point shows us that God is able. He is more than able, as evidenced by miraculous victories. So why couldn't the Israelites drive out the Canaanites, as the text says in this verse? We know they were comfortable in their homes, in their productive lands, and they had become apathetic about God's calling on their lives. And as a result of this apathy, they abandoned their belief in God's ability, and they turned to false gods. In verse 21, we see, but the people, Judges 1, verse 21, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And that phrase, to this day, here means being around the time of King David's reign, or his coming into power. And then in Judges 1, verses 27 through 36, I'm not going to read it through, but we see tribe after tribe listed with the follow through that they did not drive out. 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 And the purpose here, it's not, we're supposed to understand that this is more than just a, oops, we didn't do this one thing that God said, but this demonstrates an utter failure on the part of the people to have enthusiasm for God's calling, and ultimately abandoning the belief that God was trustworthy and able. And so what was the result? In Judges 2, verses 7 and verse 10 says, "And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel." I just get chills thinking of all that God has done up until this point, that his people have witnessed. Every miracle, every provision, every forgiveness, and every display of steadfast love. And in their apostasy, they did not proclaim his works. And one generation later, those people did not know the Lord or what he had done. One generation. That's their kids. And I don't know if we can even really wrap our brains around it. But here's the truth. It's easy to look at the Israelites and say, how could you? But we gloss over one major purpose of the book of Judges, which is to remind us of humanity's need for a savior. It's like blaming Adam and Eve for letting sin into the garden. Like, how could they? And I used to be that kid who thought, how could Adam and Eve do that? How could they disobey God? They had everything they needed. And I just vividly remember being in discipleship one time, which was like a weekly service in my middle school. And someone was speaking and telling a story about this very idea. And he tells a story of a little boy who also wrestles with this idea that he can't believe Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate the fruit of the tree that they weren't supposed to. And he knows that if he was in the garden, he would have listened to God. And so he has some family member, I don't know why I'm thinking like an uncle, but it was probably a dad. His dad is like, okay, I'm going into town for the day. I'm leaving you here. You have everything you need. I've taken care of every meal. You don't need anything. You just get to stay here and you get to stay safe. And I provided everything that you could need. Just do me one favor. And he hands them this beautiful ornate box with like a latch on it. And he says, just while I'm gone today, don't open this box. And the little boy's like, okay, that's fine, Dad. And so his dad leaves and time just kind of ticks on, and the boy finds himself thinking about the box more and more and more. And it's near the end of the day, and he can't get it out of his head. And he finally says to himself, you know what, I'm just gonna sneak this little latch open. I'm gonna take a little peek here. My dad will never know. It's probably not that big of a deal. And as soon as he slides the latch open and cracks open the box, a bird just bursts out of the box and flies away. And he has this sinking feeling, his pit in the stomach, and he just knows, his dad comes back, they talk about it, but I remember hearing that story and just knowing, yeah, it would have been us too. We would have chosen sin, and we are in just as much danger as the Israelites are of falling into these failures. So where do we go from this place? We have apathy, we have apostasy, and we know we are not better than them. But it's not about shame, and it's not about discouragement, because on this side of the cross, we know that Jesus redeems Judges. And in his sinless perfection, he is the opposite of our failures. So, first of all, the opposite of apostasy is loyalty, which is giving or showing firm and constant support or allegiance to a person or an institution. And apathy. If apathy is barely caring, then its opposite would be caring so immensely that it's hardly containable. And the word that came to my mind was passion. And you know what happens when you Google the definition of passion? You get two hits. The first it says strong and barely controllable emotion. And the second hit that you see is the suffering and death of Jesus. Now, as I prepared to teach today, I sat with this for a minute, thinking at first, no, that's not what I was thinking when I think of passion, the opposite of apathy. But then I looked a little more closely and thought about that time, which we sometimes call Passion Week, or the Passion of the Christ, that time from Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane to his death on the cross. And it's called the Passion or Passion Week, because passion comes from the Latin word passio, which means to suffer and to endure. And what better opposite to apathy, which is a lack of enthusiasm, that Jesus was willing to endure the deepest suffering on our behalf. And as I prayed, it became clear that this was actually a great place to begin, with the reminder that not only does Jesus teach us a way to live in opposite to what we see in the book of Judges, as we're going to explore in the weeks to come, but that his passion covers everything in a way that we could never replicate. Now, the Passion account can be found in Matthew 26 and 27, Mark 14 and 15, Luke 22 and 23, and John 18 and 19. And that's a lot of scripture that we're not going to read today. But if it's been a while, I just encourage you to pick one of these passages and just meditate on what Jesus went through for each and every person who would call upon his name. Now, Isaiah chapter 53, it's a prophecy, by the way, which is written about 700 years before the events of the Passion. This chapter gives us a good overview of Christ's suffering. So I'm going to read that here, a section from Isaiah 53, starting in verse 3 and going through verse 6. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So how does Jesus redeem the apathy and apostasy in Judges? With the most passion-filled response that one could give. The suffering-filled surrender of his life, covering every sin imaginable. Now, in the face of ultimate testing in his humanity, he did not allow himself to become too overwhelmed or lose his drive for his purpose here on earth or abandon his belief. And we may hear this and be tempted to respond with a white-knuckle response. Well, if Jesus didn't lose his purpose, then I won't either. But we need to remember he was also fully God. And he did it to cover every moment that you did and will lose your enthusiasm. He did it to cover the days when your belief feels shaken. He did enough so you would never have to be. Christ did enough so you would never have to be. Now, we're going to spend some time thinking about passion in the New Testament and how we are called to live. And, the modern meaning of the word passion is often a fleeting feeling. And in the epistles, passion is often used in the context of passion of the flesh, which is bad. So the word that you'll be frequently looking at and reading about instead will be zeal, which means a great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or objective. So enjoy your time talking and discussing the passages, and we'll come back together in about 25 minutes.